and welcome. My name is Meephilis and this is Literally Graphic. And today I am finally closing on a door on a much too long chapter in my life, which started 6 years ago with the dude I met off OkCupid, and which was taken to the next level last year when I actually started reading the series, and now I am finally closing, at least on the manga portion. Not the anime portion, still need to work on that. Which is to say, I would like to announce that I have finally finished the manga series Mushishi. Woo! But if you would like a more initial thoughts video, then you should definitely check out my initial thoughts video, which I will be linking. Ringing in at a mere 10 volumes, I really should have plowed through this story much sooner and more quickly. But hey, like most people on this planet, I'm pretty easily distracted by other things and news series and pretty books at the library. That said, since this is a collection of slice of life short stories rather than something with a super important overarching plotline, dipping one's toe in and out of the series might even improve one's reading experience, so perhaps this all worked out for good. As someone who really fell in love with this manga series at first sight, I did enjoy having the opportunity to come back to it over and over and over again and just wallow in its delight, which obviously would just have not been quite as enjoyable if I had just actually, dedicated myself to reading the series and gotten it over with. Even less plot-driven than my other favorite slice of life manga, Sunny, through world building, Urushibara still manages to make each story feel like it is building on top of the last to build something more than each individual part in and of itself. Despite starting out life as a series of one-shot stories, which she wasn't even sure would actually ever get published anywhere, by the third volume, Urushibara is not only setting out to create new stories, she's also doubling back on herself to connect what we already know in a new and interesting ways, with a little bit more backstory for our main protagonist character. The formula for each story is pretty straightforward, with Ginkgo solving someone's Mushi problem, but each is pretty unique and all of them had a very genuine feel to them. There are even a few stories that give us more of a background on Ginkgo, as I said, but it's not done in such a way that makes you feel like the story is really progressing anywhere, just that you have a better understanding of the whole. Like I've commented before on more than one slice of life manga, it's not so much about pushing the plot forward as it is developing the story in a more horizontal world-building manner. I say this a million times in a million different ways, as much for my own benefit to try and really get a grasp on what I really like about slice of my life manga as to actually persuade you of anything, though I think can be a bit of a hard concept to necessarily communicate effectively. Running the gamut from light to dark, the fantasy of this series does cross over from generally creepy to outright horror from time to time. Overall, I would generally describe the series as very light horror, but a few times it does dip a bit further into something resembling body horror. Mushishi are supernatural microbe-like creatures that provide a magical logic for all things scientifically unknown, and this can be rather disconcerting. Combined with the very relaxed and slow build of each short story, there is a lot more psychological rather than action-oriented horror at play. As far as female representation is concerned, I will admit that the stories do tend to fall into an all too familiar rhythm of wandering male guru saving females in distress, a majority of the time. That said, the key to this not annoying me seems to be the lack of highly differentiated genders. Neither Ginkgo or any of the other male characters are particularly masculine, and none of the women are particularly feminine beyond what we would consider traditional gender role, which does feel somewhat natural considering the historic overall ambiance that's going on in this rather nebulous time period in which the series is set. The author herself admits that, especially because it kind of morphed from a collection of short stories she was never sure if they would actually get published to an ongoing series, that trying to pin it to one specific time period is impossible, with Ginkgo presenting, especially at the beginning, as a much more modern character than the more isolationist countryside he's wandering through. There are also a few key deviations from this formula as well, in which male characters are victims and or deal well with being wrong and or vulnerable, and as I found in a couple of other series, Dragon Ball and Tekken King Creek come to mind, my enjoyment of a male-centered series increases exponentially with the ability of the male characters to be vulnerable and not to always present as kind of the quintessential, I don't know, a couple frames from Batman come to mind immediately where he's just like this hulking mass of totally ripped muscle and he's going to like beat the shit out of you. Yeah, toxic masculinity. It certainly doesn't hurt that unlike, say, the corpse delivery service, Mushishi is a much more chill story. Women and female corpses are not sexualized with the cis-het male gaze in mind, and almost every story involves extremely strong and loving relationships within communities and particularly within families. So the overall tone of the stories are rather soft, and so it definitely did not necessarily feel toxic or abrasive, although there was definitely a lot of female victims in the story. Looking back at the art, while I will admit that it's not the most astounding and mind-blowing shit on the street, as represented by more than a few Goodreads reviews, I still really enjoyed it. Loose and flowing, it's not a beginner manga, but it's not a super hard to read one either. The not terribly detailed style that gets mildly trippy from time to time added to the ambiance in my humble opinion. And as I mentioned before, there is traditional historical sort of feel after the first few stories, which helps add to the timelessness and folktale feel overall. I'm not being objective at all, but fuck it. Who would I recommend this story to besides everyone, which is basically what always happens when I really enjoy a manga for some reason? Well, I don't see this as being a hugely mature work. I do think there's a certain level of boringness that is required to actually sit down and meander your way through such a quiet book, so like perhaps a more older audience. People who enjoy books that tackle fantastical natural history would likely also find a lot to enjoy in this series. Good example of a adult manga that doesn't necessarily depend on either sexuality or on violence, but still feels somewhat mature. And that's a wrap. And as always, Literally Graphic is recorded on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation. I live here because of British colonization, Indigenous genocide, and more geographically specific, Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase, which was finalized in 1805 between representatives of the Crown and certain Mississauga peoples. This treaty was a lie and has since been broken many times over. Saying so reflects only my own small steps towards knowing the truth and does nothing for reconciliation.